Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone from the Arkansas Outdoor Catering and Event Services to this lecture. I'm Bryce Woods, and I'm an occupational health consultant. As the temperatures begin to rise, you all know it's time for the outdoor catering season to begin. In order to ensure a fun, lucrative, and most importantly, safe spring and summer for your business, we'll be discussing the causes of foodborne illness and what you can do to prevent them. We'll be discussing the 8 most common foodborne illnesses, including the pathogens causing the disease, which foods they like to contaminate, the diseases they cause, and a bit of their prevalence here in the United States. We'll also go over the principles of food safety to ensure you have a strong foundation for the next topic, prevention. We'll discuss strategies to ensure that you are preventing contamination of your products while you're prepping and cooking the product, during the time you're serving the product to clients, and even before you see your food products. To end, we'll talk about the Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points Policy, or HACCP, your company has just adopted, and how everything we've mentioned in the lecture is what guides the formation and execution of this plan to prevent contamination and foodborne illness. So to start, I'd like to pose the question of what is a foodborne illness? It's not uncommon to hear that someone has gotten food poisoning from a local restaurant, but what exactly does that mean? Well, the CDC defines foodborne illness or food poisoning as any disease or illness directly caused by bacteria, viruses, parasites, or their related toxins. All of these illnesses will cause some degree of what's known as gastroenteritis, a condition in which some sort of insult to the GI tract occurs, whether that be the release of a toxin that revs up the process of digestion, causing diarrhea, or it could be a pathogen that actually infects the intestinal lining, which leads to deficits in digestion and absorption. Some of these illnesses may also cause a more systemic disease, meaning they cause fevers, muscle aches, and fatigue. And while you'll hear me say that most of these illnesses are self-limited, meaning they resolve on their own after a few days with no long-term problems, some of the diseases we'll mention can actually have some devastating consequences. So it's incredibly important for you all to be following your HACCP guidelines to ensure your clients never have to worry about getting one of these bugs. And before we move into the causative pathogens, I think it's also important to discuss who is most at risk to develop a foodborne illness. Be sure to recognize that anyone can get food poisoning, but there are some populations that have higher risk of contracting the illnesses. These include the elderly, who may have some degree of decline of their immune system's ability to fight pathogens, children who have not fully developed a strong immune system, immunocompromised people, such as those who have contracted an infection of their immune system, like HIV, AIDS, or were born without a fully functional immune system, and last but certainly not least, pregnant women. While pregnant women have a fully developed immune system, they are essentially fighting for two and are more susceptible to some infections. And several of these foodborne illnesses actually can have devastating effects on fetal development. What you'll notice about the following pathogens is that there are some recurring themes as to how the food may get contaminated, and these really play into the principles of food safety as well as your HACCP guidelines. These include, but aren't limited to, leaving food at room temperature or environmental temperatures, which can be a real problem for a catering company like Arkansas Outdoor Catering and Event Services, because you'll commonly deal with meals outside in the warm and humid Arkansas spring and summer temperatures. I've included a growth curve on this slide that shows how temperature affects the rate of growth of E. coli, a bacterium we'll be discussing in a few minutes. As you can see, E. coli is able to grow best right at 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And as we all know, that's not an uncommon temperature outdoors during the spring and summertime. Other factors leading to contamination are not fully cooking meat products, improper refrigeration, in which a fridge is too warm to actually halt microbial growth, cross-contamination, in which germs from raw meat contaminate fresh produce that won't be cooked adequately to kill the germs, consuming unpasteurized dairy products, and the last would be improper handling of food, which tends to mostly mean improper hand hygiene. You'll notice that this is the most common way to contaminate food, which is why the World Health Organization states that hand hygiene is the most important measure you can take to prevent the spread of germs. With that said, we'll start talking about the 8 most common foodborne illnesses, and then we'll move into what you as a food services company can do to minimize contamination and outbreaks of food poisoning. The first microbe we'll talk about is norovirus. This is by far the most common GI pathogen, representing 18% of all gastroenteritis cases in the world, and having upwards of 5 million confirmed cases every year in the U.S. Being a viral infection, it's known to cause a rapid onset and resolution of symptoms. Though not necessarily the most deadly pathogen we'll discuss, it is very infectious as it only requires a handful of viral particles to actually cause disease in a healthy adult. It's spread via the fecal-oral route, so the most common way that this bug will get to your clients is by improper hand hygiene of those coming in contact with your food products. It also will be able to contaminate food left out, say in a catering line or buffet line, as people come through and pass the germ from their hands to the food. Next up is Campylobacter jejuni, the most common bacterial cause of diarrheal illness in the U.S. It's able to cause a self-limited gastroenteritis, and it will actually penetrate and infect the intestinal lining, leading to bloody diarrhea. The most common way to have your clients contract this disease would be to serve undercooked poultry products. Interestingly, Campylobacter is highly associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurologic disorder causing self-limited paralysis. Of all patients with Guillain-Barré syndrome, nearly 30% will have a preceding Campylobacter infection. Campylobacter is also associated with reactive arthritis, a migratory arthritis that may also have urologic and eye problems. Another bacterial cause of food poisoning is Salmonella enteritidis. It causes salmonellosis, and there were just over 1.5 million cases of salmonellosis reported in the U.S. in 2015. Salmonella contamination most often comes from poultry products. Other sources would be contaminated veggies and unpasteurized dairy. Salmonella actually is naturally found in the intestines of untreated chickens, and when the birds lay their eggs, it frequently will cross-contaminate the eggs, so you may want to think twice before eating that cookie dough made with free-range chicken eggs. Salmonella causes a self-limited gastroenteritis, though some rare strains are very dangerous to certain populations, such as people with sickle cell disease who can develop Salmonella osteomyelitis, an infection of the bone by Salmonella. The next most common cause of foodborne illness is Clostridium perfringens. There were about 1 million cases of Clostridium perfringens gastroenteritis reported in 2018. It's a spore-forming bacteria, meaning it's able to form spores that can survive in very harsh conditions, so even just barely undercooking meat products may lead to the proliferation of the bacteria due to the spore's resilience. Rather than actively infecting the bowel, it causes gastroenteritis by releasing pre-made toxins that cause the intestines to become very hyperactive. The most common way to contaminate food with Clostridium is by undercooking beef products. The gastroenteritis it causes is self-limited and has a very rapid onset due to its preformed toxins being able to quickly act on the intestinal lining. In very rare cases, Clostridium may cause gas gangrene of the bowel, in which it actively infects the intestines, leading to the death and breakdown of them. Another common cause of foodborne illness is Staphylococcus aureus. Now, if you were to Google Staphylococcus infections, you'd find a huge number as it's one of the most common infections in general. But, more specifically, there are about 256,000 cases of staph gastroenteritis per year. The gastroenteritis it causes is also caused by preformed toxins, so if one is infected with staph, they can expect to have a very rapid onset of symptoms. The gastroenteritis is self-limited and actually only rarely causes diarrhea based on the nature of action of its toxins. Staph aureus is notorious for being multi-drug resistant, so though you won't usually need to treat a staph gastroenteritis with antibiotics, in the rare case that you do, you may have some significant trouble finding an effective drug. It commonly is passed to food through improper food handling and poor hand hygiene, and the foods it normally contaminates are beef and pork, as well as cold dairy products like the ice cream shown in this slide. Next, we have a non-bacterial cause of foodborne illness called toxoplasmosis, which is caused by Toxoplasma gondii. It's an intracellular parasite that is most commonly found in cats, so naturally the easiest way for it to contaminate food would be from poor hand hygiene after exposure to a cat's litter box. A very important note, it is able to cross the placenta and cause an awful fetal infection, leading to significant developmental problems and commonly fetal demise, which is why most doctors will tell pregnant women to stay away from their cat's litter box. While it normally will cause a self-limited gastroenteritis, it also may spread to the brain and cause abscesses. Toxoplasmosis infection is also associated with development of schizophrenia later in life, so it stands to reason that this can be a very morbid infection for your clients to get from your food. Our penultimate pathogen is Listeria monocytogenes, a bacteria that is ubiquitously present in soil and natural water reservoirs. It commonly contaminates unwashed produce, cold cuts from the deli, and dairy products. The gastroenteritis it causes is delayed in nature and usually will have an associated fever. If left untreated, listeriosis can lead to some major complications like meningitis, hepatitis, or rupture of the spleen, so it's absolutely imperative to prevent this infection as well as recognize it if you do have an outbreak. Additionally, it's also very dangerous to fetuses, and pregnant women are actually 10 times more susceptible to being infected by Listeria. So, really watch out if you're planning on having deli sandwiches or a dairy based side around a group of several pregnant women. Our last and arguably the most well known bacteria on this list is Escherichia coli. This bacteria is a common resident of the human GI tract and is actually very important in helping us digest food products. However, there are some strands that are not so kind and will cause gastroenteritis if given the chance. One of these strands is enterotoxigenic E. coli that causes traveler's diarrhea, a self-limited gastroenteritis with watery diarrhea, usually from drinking tainted water. The more severe strand is enterohemorrhagic E. coli, which comes from cow products like beef or unpasteurized milk. It actively invades the intestinal lining and will lead to bloody diarrhea and a very painful gastroenteritis. What's worse is that it may lead to a condition known as hemolytic uremic syndrome, which can be deadly as it causes destruction of blood cells and a platelet dysfunction that can lead to severe internal bleeding. So, with all of that lovely information about food poisoning, you're probably wondering how this pertains to your field. After all, this isn't a microbiology lecture, this is a food safety lecture. I wouldn't expect you to remember all of these bugs or their details, but I hope you're able to see some of the principles of food safety and foodborne illness and what can happen to your clients should they get food poisoning from your products. Further, I hope that you can now recognize that if your company were to have an outbreak, it could lead to some pretty poor outcomes for the future of the business. With that said, let's talk about prevention, and the best way to do that is to start with the basics. The Global Food Safety Resource outlines 7 pillars of food safety for caterers that are essential to preventing foodborne illness, so we'll go through those now. The first pillar is sanitary suppliers. Your food supplier needs to have some reliable form of food safety certification to indicate that their food is meeting quality standards for freshness and isn't being contaminated, especially if you're working with higher risk foods like the ones we've mentioned previously. You also want to make sure that your standards are at or are higher than your standards according to the HACCP guidelines. By doing this, you can ensure that your food isn't contaminated before it even reaches you. The next pillar is sanitary preparation. Whether your company is preparing the food or you are being sent pre-prepared food, this is absolutely crucial as prepping food is one of the easiest places for contamination of food to occur. Sanitary preparation includes hand hygiene, which we've discussed is among the most important acts your staff need to be doing to prevent illness, and it also includes avoidance of cross-contamination, as it shows in this graphic where the raw meat prep station is completely separate from the produce prep station, since the produce requires no cooking. The next pillar is sanitary transport, which is something very unique to the catering industry. This pillar essentially states that you need to keep your hot foods hot, that is above 145 degrees Fahrenheit, and your cold foods cold, below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This can be difficult to manage, but it is crucial. Just remember that growth curve we talked about earlier, or imagine that if your food is falling outside of those safe margins, any microbes on the food could be rampantly reproducing, all of which leads to sick clients. The fourth pillar is sanitary serving, which is very similar because temperature control is also a large component of this pillar. While serving, you need to be maintaining the same temperature controls we just talked about for the purpose of illness prevention. You can also think of both of these as components of good customer service. Your clients will not be satisfied with their food if they receive cold entrees and inappropriately warm desserts. To manage these temperatures, you should be using something like the insulated warmer and chafing dish shown in these slides. Additionally, for Pillar 4, that is often forgotten, you need to ensure that your dishes have their own serving utensils. The fifth pillar is training. Just like you all are getting some training on foodborne illness, all of your employees, especially those in direct contact with food, need to be adequately trained to ensure they know all guidelines regarding food safety. You should also be providing refresher courses for safe food preparation, transport, and serving, as well as have a quality control in place to make sure every employee is exceeding your standards for food safety. The sixth pillar is related to having a full menu for food allergen purposes. While not in the scope of this talk, this is a very important consideration, and your clients should know at the very least common allergens in the food that is to be served at their event. The last pillar is documentation, and it is exceedingly important. You should be able to produce at any given time things like certifications of your company and any companies you get food from, an accurate history of each of your employees' food safety training, logs of preparation procedures, and temperatures of your food every 15 minutes, and even liability waivers. Think about it. If your clients are taking leftovers home, you need them to know that you aren't liable for the food once it is out of the company's possession and control. If it can be documented, document it so that you can ensure your clients that you are providing top quality food services, and it could help you should a health inspector audit your operations. So, now that we've discussed the principles of food safety, our next and last topic will be how do we implement these principles into actual prevention of illness and excellent service to our clients? The answer? The HACCP model. The Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points model is a comprehensive system for your company to manage food safety. It's based on 7 key principles, and once properly implemented, you'll have positive results and data to show areas that you can improve in. Some benefits that are seen after adopting a HACCP model would be cost savings through better utilization of your product, an increase in quality of your products and service, a stronger sense of consistency in all aspects of your operation, larger profit margins, and most importantly, better employee awareness of food safety. So now, let's discuss the basis of how you will see the HACCP implemented in your company. As we've stated, the HACCP model is essentially the utilization of 7 principles. I hope you can recognize that we have talked about these principles today in one way or another. The first step is performing a hazard analysis, which will involve identification of potential hazards within your operation. This may include determining if your equipment is working properly, how you are currently preparing, storing, and serving food products, and it will also make sure your employees are adhering to health policies such as proper hand washing or staying home if sick. The next step is to decide on critical control points. After your analysis, you are left with control measures, and now it's time to decide which of these measures are able to be controlled efficiently by employees and measures that are essential to ensuring safe food. After this, you'll move into step 3, which is determining the critical limits of these CCPs. These are the margins in which you can safely keep your CCPs within to ensure food safety. An example that we've talked about would be the CCP of food temperature, for which you can establish a critical lower limit of hot food to be 145 degrees Fahrenheit. After this, you'll create procedures to monitor these CCPs and their limits, which means you'll start using things like temperature logs to ensure the product is staying well above a critical limit temperature, just as was recommended in the Pillars of Food Safety for Caterers. The 5th step in the HACCP model is establishing corrective actions. These are the ways you will manage a problem with a CCP. Perhaps this would mean throwing out food that's below the temperature limit or increasing the heat of a chafing dish as the food in it nears the critical limit. After this, the next step is establishing a verification procedure to ensure the system is operating directly according to the plan. Essentially, these are the quality control measures we mentioned in the principles of food safety. The last step is establishing a record-keeping system. This is all that documentation we mentioned in the 7 pillars. This documentation will give concrete evidence of how your system is running and where a problem occurred if that's the case. After talking through the HACCP principles, it's easy to see that this system was made with the pillars of food safety in mind. So in conclusion, I hope you've learned something today about foodborne illnesses. In particular, I hope that you now know more about the dangers these illnesses pose to you, your clients, and your company. And I hope I have shed some light on your company's new HACCP model for food safety management. By following this new model and the pillars of food safety, I'm confident that your business will have a safe, healthy, and successful outdoor season. Here are a list of references used for this talk, and I'll take any questions you may have now. Thanks!